If the New York Jets are in position to get a Malik Neighbors or Rome Odunze at 10th overall, we're approaching Dynasty Doomsday. How can you reasonably expect both Garrett Wilson and either of those two receivers to meet to really reach their ceilings of consistent wide receiver ones? Now, Aaron Rodgers, historically, look at the 13 full years he's started, two of which he has actually been able to support two wide receiver ones effectively in fantasy, two top 10 receivers. 2014 with Jordy Nelson and Randall Cobb. 2016, again with Jordy Nelson, this time Devontae Adams. So you're telling me there's a chance, 15.3%. When we think about that timeline, was there ever truly a running back as well to the talent of a Brees Hall? If you want to say the overlap in receiver talent didn't rise to the level of warranting more than two seasons, that's your prerogative. That's fine. Nonetheless, for these two receivers in this case to share such a relevancy, such a prime overlap, I just don't like what it means for Dynasty and them really being able to reach their upside. Not saying that it's likely, I'm just accounting for this possibility. In a perfect world, let's say Aaron Rodgers meets those two seasons out of 13 in supporting two wide receiver one types, assuming that he stays healthy and he's not a vice president, assuming that he plays out through 2024 into 2025, what do we really project beyond? It's just going to be the same Jets quarterback carousel, and that's something in and of itself where maybe some pause for Garrett Wilson, but not really, assuming he is going to be that bona fide wide receiver one. But in this case, we can't assume. You know what happens when you assume. And so this is just me anticipating, accounting for this scenario. Similarly to Garrett Wilson, his former Ohio State teammate Chris Olave in a similar boat, a top 10 wide receiver in the dynasty landscape for the last year or two. What is his future if the Saints at 14 opt to go with a Brian Thomas Jr., for example? A guy who really is in that next crop, the next best chance to be a wide receiver one type. Not saying that is the just blanket expectation for a Brian Thomas Jr. I think more likely than not, he's a very, very competent second option, high end at that, but he still has that talent to be a competitor for targets to a Chris Olave, to take away from him however much or however little, who knows? But nonetheless, I think it is a actual possibility that you see the Saints draft a receiver in the first round. I mean, who else do they have? I know offensive line tackle is a big issue. If it comes down to it, a best player available, maybe it's the relatively hometown receiver out of LSU and Brian Thomas Jr. In the same way, competition at 10 poses a real threat to Garrett Wilson, competition at potentially 14 would pose a real threat to Chris Olave. Playing my own devil's advocate, let's do a 180 and be full glass half full here, like I am most of the time on this channel, and say that another body, another considerable talent in that room actually can help free up a Chris Olave, for example. Well, we go back to who's throwing them the ball. A Derek Carr in the twilight of his career, no disrespect. Nonetheless, my take is that quarterback longevity and receiver room competition, it just doesn't rise even to a level in a perfect world where these guys really retain this implied artificial value. Let's pivot to how a drafted player could potentially really be put into a not so ideal situation, take a blow really to relevancy and dynasty viability in general. And for me, that's my hometown Philadelphia Eagles with their second round pick, a fringe top 50 pick. They pick at 50 exactly, but then fringe being 53rd. Let's say they address defense, the offensive or defensive line like we always do. Picking from potentially a luxury spot, if you want to say that. Nonetheless, a roster that is one of the relatively better ones in the NFL. Who's to say they don't address receiver and receiver three and the absolute glaring hole it's created with a Quez Watkins, a Julio Jones in the twilight of his career, no disrespect, but a player you think, oh, what if they catch that ball in the Super Bowl? A little bit of a salty fan. They take a step back here, but nonetheless, Who's to say, oh my God, what happens to that early mid-second round pick you have and your favorite receiver? You're looking for a Roman Wilson, for example. Had McConkey, had Nye Mitchell. We've seen him get mocked in most recently my mock draft I did. It is not going to bode well at all if a receiver goes to the Eagles with one of those 50, 53rd, one of those top picks. You're going to compete within that own room, obviously, an A.J. Brown, a Devontae Smith. And look, Devontae Smith, there's the contract rumor. So it's like, well, what do you mean? They're going to lock down Devontae Smith for a contract? If anything, why would you not take advantage, throw a receiver that is relatively cheap, drastically cheaper compared to now those two wide receiver one salaried players? So it even makes more sense to me in that sense. So really, really uphill battle to that player possibly producing to any level you had hoped. Can you guess the position? Well, if you guessed once again receiver and the threat of this player and another player already on that roster, you guessed right. We're talking about the Baltimore Ravens picking at 62 and even extending it to 93 if you want. For me, the Baltimore Ravens, day 2, is quite the dangerous situation for dynasty players. You really only have Zay Flowers in that room, so I think they're just screaming to look for a number 2, so to speak, in theory, to inject into that offense. But who knows? You've got players like a Ricky Pearsall, like a Keon Coleman, who could rise to a level in talent that's already, as a prospect, not in a different world than what Zay Flowers was, to put some context into the receiver talent of this class. And so you consider Lamar, you consider now Derrick Henry, of course, you've got Mark Andrews. One, it's a big time threat and a big hit to, I think, Zay Flowers and his dynasty viability and his ceiling, absolutely. And then for that receiver, once again, maybe it's your favorite receiver prospect as a day 2 non-first round type player. It's another big hit to, in theory, those early second round picks. There's only so many teams. There's so many talented players. That's some, I think, interesting, just some grounded food for thought at this time of year. It's not all going to go according to plan for these receivers and all players at that rate. Running backs, some quarterbacks, of course, even at the top of the draft, arguably, and tight ends. The landing spots are not all going to be perfect. So this exercise is really meant to just be thought-provoking, anticipate, brace for possibly the worst of things. We know there's going to be some good, but we know there's going to be some bad. And so the Baltimore Ravens having a Zay Flowers and then in theory, Ricky Pearsall just doesn't bode all too well for either of their ceilings, given the Ravens' identity. Enough receiver talk. Let's talk about a draft pick that has serious running back ramifications, possibly. The Los Angeles Rams, picking at 83. So you know who we're talking about now, Kyren Williams. Do they want to spell Kyren Williams from the insane usage that he had when he was healthy? Do they want to realize, look, the 4 games that he was hurt in the middle of the season, we went 1-3, and clearly we're at a lack of talent compared to what we were used to. Do we spell Kyren Williams? Do we bring in somebody else? I am not saying that it's likely. I don't quite expect it, to be honest, but I have to acknowledge it here. And so you look at pick 83. Look, in this draft, we could be talking about RB2, 3, 4. And so then you're saying Trey Benson, Jalen Wright, Marshawn Lloyd. Ay, ay, ay. That would be such a disgusting running back head case of a situation to make sense of. It, of course, I think would absolutely take a big shot to Kyren Williams and his value, and then it completely, in an already not so ideal top-heavy running back class, crosses off effectively the relevancy, the ceiling, the floor even, of a top back in this class. Do these scenarios, do these outcomes ultimately provide potential buy low opportunities? Sure. But they nonetheless seriously affect and threaten the dynasty values of multiple players we hold in extremely high regard. For as much as we love April, this time of year, and the draft season, all the hype, the rookie fever, There are going to be some quote unquote losers. So we have to do our due diligence and embrace, at least account for it. Let me know what you guys thought of this video, if you liked it, if you hated it, what you want to see in the future. Have a great weekend, guys. I will see you in the next one.